Dog 1 is not open!
Those were the words that echoed across the radio frequencies on June the 6th, 1944. The signal that the beaches were not clear. At that moment, American soldiers were watching tanks emerge from the English Channel like metal whales surfacing for air, tanks that were swimming. What you're about to witness is the story of the Sherman DD, the Duplex Drive tank that challenged every law of physics the Germans thought they knew. These were machines that weighed 32 tons, wrapped in canvas walls and pushed by tiny propellers, attempting the impossible, to deliver armoured firepower directly from ship to shore. This is the story of the tank that learned to swim. To understand why anyone would try to make a tank swim, we need to understand the problem the Allies faced in 1944. For 2 years, the German Atlantic Wall had been growing stronger. Fortifications, minefields, anti-tank obstacles and devastating gun positions covered every conceivable landing beach. The defenders had calculated exactly where the tanks would emerge from landing craft ramps and positioned their kill zones accordingly. 300 metres of open beach under concentrated fire, their mathematics were perfect. But the Allies had learned hard lessons from previous operations. Dieppe had shown them the cost of unsupported infantry assaults. The Pacific had proven that armour arriving on beaches faced almost certain destruction. The solution seemed almost absurd: make the tanks swim. The concept wasn't entirely new. Flotation devices had been experimented with since World War I. But what the British engineers developed in 1943 was something different: a collapsible canvas screen that could be raised around a tank's hull, creating a boat-shaped container. The tank's own weight would push it down into the water, but the air trapped inside the canvas walls would keep it afloat. Two small propellers, powered by the tank's own engine, would push it forward at about 4 miles an hour. The British first adapted this system to the Valentine tank in April 1943, but the Americans saw bigger potential with the Sherman. The Sherman was better suited to the modification than the Valentine. Unlike the British tank, the Sherman didn't need to point its gun towards the rear to raise the canvas, a significant tactical advantage. Here's how it worked. The canvas screen was supported by 36 rubber tubes that could be inflated by compressed air. When raised, which took about 15 minutes, the screen increased the tank's freeboard, allowing it to float without adding flotation devices to the sides. Once the tank reached shore, the screen could be rapidly collapsed in just a few seconds, so the tank could engage the enemy immediately. Twin propellers at the rear of the tank could swim it at about 4.6 miles per hour. Steering could be accomplished either by the driver, who could swivel the propellers using a hydraulic system, or by the commander from his station on the platform at the rear of the turret. An electrically operated bilge pump kept the interior of the tank free of water. A gyroscopic direction indicator helped with the navigation. Waterproof radios let the crews communicate while swimming. They weren't just floating tanks, they were swimming fortresses. Training was intense and dangerous. On April the 4th, 1944, during trials, 6 Valentine DD tanks sank with the loss of 6 crew members. Men who had joined the army to fight in tanks found themselves learning to swim in full combat gear. On D-Day, 8 British, Canadian and American tank battalions were equipped with DD tanks. They would be moved near to the beaches using tank landing crafts, which carried between 4 to 5 DD Shermans each. They then would be launched about 3 kilometres or 2 miles from the shore and swim to the beaches. But here's what many people don't realise. DD tanks were meant to remain partially submerged off the shore. They weren't meant to go all the way to the beach. They were meant to stay in the water and provide fire support over the top of their skirting. Utah Beach saw conditions that favoured DD tanks deployment. Many Shermans launched relatively close to the shore, and 27 of the 28 in that first wave reached land safely. Their presence provided immediate firepower against the German strongpoints. And then there's Omaha. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. The conditions at Omaha Beach on the 6th of June were nothing like that the tanks had been trained for. The sea state was more like a force 4, with winds exceeding 18 knots and waves between 4 and 6 feet high. The tanks had to be launched further out to sea. Their small propellers struggled to deal with the waves that broke over the tanks, while the currents dragged them off course. Many tanks began to fill with water. As the waves picked up, more water entered, and they sank, dragging their crews down with them, completely unable to escape. Of the first 29 tanks put into the sea, 27 sank. Out of the complete assault group of 56 tanks, only 16 landed successfully. But here's what the documentaries don't tell you. There was another assault group at Omaha. Assault Group 02, the 753rd Tank Battalion, had a different commander. Lieutenant Dean Rockwell of the US Navy recognised that the sea was too rough to release the tanks at 6,000 yards. Instead, he decided to release them very close to the shore. This put the landing craft at greater risk of enemy fire, and indeed 2 landing craft were hit, causing many casualties. But of the 56 tanks due to land on this side of the beach, 42 landed successfully. The movie Saving Private Ryan shows Tom Hanks saying, "No tanks have made it to the shore." But for veterans of the 743rd Tank Battalion, who were actually some of the first people to land on that shore, that line cut deep. So how many DD tanks actually made it to the shore on D-Day? Let's look at the figures. Of the 142 DD tanks and deep wading tanks used at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, 107 made it ashore. That's a success rate of 74%. On the British and Canadian beaches, 194 tanks were deployed and 162 managed to reach the beach, an 83% success rate. It is far from the total failure as it's often depicted. At Gold Beach, where the sea was far rougher, 8 tanks went down in the swell. However, unlike at Omaha, further DD tank launches were halted immediately and the tanks were rushed in closer to shore. This saved many lives. At Sword Beach, DD tanks went into the water in relatively calm weather, only 4 kilometres from shore. 5 tanks were unable to be launched due to canvas tears, so they were later landed directly and fought normally. At Juneau Beach, only the DD tanks of the first Hussars were launched. 21 of 29 reached the beach. The idea that all DD tanks failed on D-Day is a myth, one that has been perpetuated by Hollywood and oversimplified in documentaries. Now let's talk about what the Germans saw. On June the 6th, 44, at Strong Point WN62 on Omaha Beach, a German machine gunner named Fron rubbed his eyes and looked through his MG42 sights. He'd seen thousands of tanks in Russia. He knew one absolute truth about tanks. They came on trains, on trucks, or drove themselves. They did not swim. But there, 700 metres out in the churning Great Atlantic, a dark angular shape rose and fell with the waves. Not a landing craft, not debris, the impossible shape of a turret. "Lieutenant," he called to his officer, voice cracking, "the Americans, their tanks are swimming." The Germans had built their Atlantic wall to stop an invasion. They could predict. They'd placed obstacles where tanks should drive, guns where tanks should unload, and mines where tanks should advance. They had never imagined tanks would bypass all that by swimming directly to the beach. Radio operators reported swimming tanks and were told they were seeing things. Officers who repeated these reports were accused of panic. Major Frederick Hoffman actually placed 2 of his subordinates under arrest for spreading what he called defeatist propaganda. One German intelligence officer actually insisted that the Allies must have built underwater bridges during the night, because tank swimming were physically impossible. By the time the German command accepted that DD tanks were real, it was too late. Now let's address the question that most people ask. How many soldiers actually died in their tanks as they sank to the bottom of the English Channel? From multiple sources, it appears that only 12 soldiers of the 741st Tank Battalion died inside their tanks as they sank in the English Channel. Another 8 soldiers from the 743rd died as their landing craft was struck by direct fire. Any losses, of course, are tragedy, but those numbers might be lower than many people originally thought. These stories deserve to be told, not to diminish the sacrifice, but to honour it properly. The DD tanks were used again in the Allied invasion of southern France in August 1944, and during the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. During these later operations in calmer waters, the tanks had an easier time and proved their worth. Post-war interest in DD tanks decreased. Main battle tanks became too heavy to swim, however some flotation screens were used in the 1980s. The impact on military doctrine was immediate and lasting. Within months of D-Day, every major military began developing amphibious armour. The principle that armour could be made amphibious changed military planning worldwide. Rivers were no longer reliable defence lines. Coastal defences had to account for armour coming from the sea. The German failure to anticipate the DD tanks revealed a deeper problem in their military thinking. They had fallen victim to what psychologists now call confirmation bias. Because German doctrine says tanks couldn't swim, any evidence that they might swim was explained away. Every military academy in the world now teaches the lesson of the DD tanks, not as a historical curiosity, but as a warning, because somewhere someone is working on the next impossible weapon that will make current defences obsolete. So, were the DD tanks a success? They weren't some wonder weapon that changed the game, but they played a key role. And the design philosophy was sound. They made a difference, even if that difference was simply saving a handful of Allied lives. Actually, it was a lot more than a handful. On D-Day, the DD Shermans couldn't overall be said to have changed the course of the battle, but where they worked, they provided immediate support to the troops. They got ashore, provided they were used correctly. It was one of the inventions that worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. It filled the gap. The story of the DD tanks is ultimately a story about innovation against the impossible. It showed that warfare isn't just about having better weapons, but about using them in ways the enemy cannot imagine. The most dangerous innovation is the one that challenges basic assumptions about what is possible. And most importantly, they demonstrate that in war, the side that stops believing in the impossible is the side that loses it.